On the morning that Eleanor realized she was the only one left alive in her village, she found herself laughing not from joy, but from the peculiar madness that comes when the world breaks in ways the mind cannot comprehend. It was late August of the year 1350, and the fields around the village of Thornfield lay golden in the morning light, waiting to be harvested. They had waited for 3 weeks now. The barley was overripe, beginning to lose its grain. The wheat was browning at the edges, the stalks becoming brittle. The rye would spoil if it wasn't cut soon. Everything that the village had worked for all year, the planting in spring, the careful weeding through summer, the prayers for good weather, the constant and vigilant management of land and labor, was about to be lost because there was no one left to bring it in. Eleanor stood at the edge of the main field and looked at the crops that needed harvesting. She was 43 years old, which was old by the standards of the medieval world. She had seen much in her life, births and deaths, good harvests and bad ones, the slow rhythms of village existence that changed little from year to year, the reliable patterns that made the world feel stable and understandable. But she had never seen anything like this. No one had. Nothing like this had happened in living memory, or in the memory of their parents' generation, or in the stories that went back to the very oldest people who had ever lived in Thornfield. The plague had come to Thornfield in May, arriving with the warm weather and the season of growth. It arrived not like an invading army with banners and drums, but like a whisper. A merchant passing through from London mentioned that there was a sickness spreading through the cities. A terrible sickness, he said, that killed people within days. But London was far away. Thornfield was a small village, surrounded by fields, far from the great cities where such things happened. Surely it would not come here, but it did come. A few people fell ill. At first, Eleanor thought it was just the ordinary illnesses that came from time to time, the summer fevers, the stomach ailments that passed after a few days of rest and prayer. But this sickness was different. The people who fell ill developed dark swellings under their arms, and in their groin, swellings about the size of eggs or even apples, black and terrible. These swellings did not respond to any of the remedies that people knew not, the poultices of herbs, not the bloodletting that the traveling surgeon attempted, not the prayers and holy water that the priest provided, and the swellings were only the beginning. People burned with fevers so high that they became delirious, speaking in languages that had been dead for centuries, seeing things that weren't there. They vomited blood. Their skin turned dark in patches, as if the body itself was rotting while the person still lived. And then, within days of falling ill, they were dead. In June, the village priest died. Father Edmund had been old anyway, 70, if he was a day and frail in ways that suggested his body was ready to leave the world. But he had still been the center of spiritual authority, the one who knew the proper prayers, who could explain God's will to a confused and frightened village. His death left a vacuum that no one could fill. A new priest came, a young man named Thomas, who had been studying to enter the clergy. He tried to do what he could, but the sickness seemed to mock him. The prayers, he said, didn't save anyone. The last rites he performed were followed by death within hours. After a month, he died too, and there was no one left to say the prayers for the dead. In July, the children began to die. This was when Eleanor truly understood that something was wrong beyond the normal patterns of disease and death. Children died sometimes. That was the way of the world, a fact that every parent in the village accepted with grim resignation. But usually it was one or two in a bad year, the very weak or the very unlucky. Not all of them. Not the entire next generation swept away in the space of weeks, as if God had decided that Thornfield would have no future. Eleanor's own children were gone. Her daughter, Margaret, who had been 19 years old, and beautiful in the way of girls on the edge of womanhood, she had been engaged to be married in the autumn. The wedding had been planned for September, and Margaret had been so excited about it that sometimes Eleanor had to tell her to pay attention to her work. The merchant's son she was engaged to had seemed kind and capable, and the marriage would have improved the family's standing in the village. But Margaret died in early July, burning with fever, crying out for her mother, her skin turning dark, her body becoming something that Eleanor's mind could not quite process as her daughter anymore. Her son, John, who was 16 years old and was learning his father's trade as a carpenter. He had been skilled with his hands, patient in a way that was unusual for boys his age. He could visualize how wood should be shaped before he cut it. He had been making furniture that people actually wanted to buy, good pieces that suggested he would be a successful craftsman. He died in the middle of July, falling ill suddenly while working in his father's workshop and being dead before nightfall. Her youngest, Thomas, who was 7 years old and had spent the summer learning to help in the fields. He had been all energy and curiosity, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked and why people did what they did. Eleanor had been teaching him to identify the different crops, to understand the rhythms of harvest. She had imagined him growing up, eventually inheriting the small piece of land that Eleanor's family owned, carrying on the work that her ancestors had done. But he died in late July, after only 3 days of sickness, and Eleanor held him as he died, helpless to do anything but witness his suffering. Her husband Robert had died a few days after Thomas. Robert had fallen ill after nursing the children, spending long hours in the sick room, trying to comfort them, trying to do anything that might help. Eleanor had told him to stay away, that he would catch the sickness, but he had refused to listen. He had been a good man, Robert, steady and reliable, the kind of man who did his duty without complaining. He had worked as a carpenter alongside his son, had provided for his family, had been respected in the village. His death was a mercy. At least the sickness only lasted 3 days in him, faster than it had been in the children. Eleanor was grateful, in a way that felt shameful, that his suffering was shorter. Eleanor had expected to die too. After Robert's death, she had waited for the fever to come, for the burning in her head and the terrible visions to begin. She had almost wanted it to come. The grief was so enormous that it seemed impossible that a body could contain it. The loss was so complete that continuing to live seemed pointless, seemed like a punishment. Why had she survived when everyone else, everyone she loved, everyone she had built her life around had died? What was the point of continuing? But the fever had never come. Days passed, then weeks. The village continued to die around her while Eleanor remained untouched by the sickness. Summer moved into August. The smell of death hung over everything. The baker died in his shop, and no one had buried him properly for days. The smith died. The baker's wife died, still trying to do her work, even as the fever consumed her. The smith's apprentices died. The old woman who lived alone at the edge of the village died in her house, alone, and Eleanor found her body 3 days later when she went to check on her. The new priest, Father Thomas, died in the church, lying on the altar as if seeking comfort from the divine. The bailiff, who collected taxes, died. Entire families died. The children died. All of them, it seemed, leaving the village empty of the sound of playing children and the promise of a future. By the end of July, Eleanor was almost certainly the only one left alive in Thornfield. She had walked through the village on one of the hot days in late July. She could not remember on which day the days had blurred together into a nightmare of grief and fear and confusion, and found empty houses in rows. Some of them had bodies in them, already beginning to decompose. The smell horrifying. The sight something that her mind kept refusing to process fully. In other houses, there were no bodies, just the evidence of people beds still made and rumpled as if the living had simply vanished in the night. Food left on tables, as if the person sitting down to eat had simply stood up and walked away. Clothes scattered on floors, the ordinary detritus of lives that had simply stopped. In the church, she found the young Father Thomas lying on the altar, as if he had been seeking comfort or had come there to die in the holiest place he could find. His body was already beginning to decompose, and the smell in the church was overwhelming. Eleanor tried to say a prayer for him but couldn't manage it. The words stuck in her throat. What prayer could capture the enormity of what had happened? She had left the church and had not returned for days. She had walked through the silent streets of the village streets that should have been full of people, full of noise and work and the ordinary chaos of life. She should have heard the sound of the smith's hammer. She should have heard children playing and mothers calling them in for meals. She should have heard people greeting each other, gossiping, laughing, doing the work that made up village life. But there was nothing. Only silence, and the sound of wind through empty buildings, and the distant sound of crows. Now it was August, well into the month, and the crops were waiting. They always waited for humans to bring in the harvest. The crops themselves didn't care whether there were people to harvest them. They would fall to the ground eventually, rot back into the earth, and provide nutrients for next year's growth. But next year seemed impossible now. The idea that there would be another year, another spring, another growing season, seemed like fantasy. Eleanor sat down in the field and looked at her hands. They were rough from work, marked with calluses from the farm and small scars from a lifetime of living. They were still capable, still strong. She was still capable, apparently. Her body had not betrayed her, had not succumbed to the sickness that had taken everyone else. Her mind still functioned, Even though she sometimes wondered if madness might be easier, she was still alive, though she couldn't remember what that was supposed to mean anymore. The work needed to be done. This was the thought that kept returning to her, like a stone worn smooth by constant handling. The crops needed harvesting. If the crops rotted in the field, if the grain was lost, then the village would starve in the winter. But there was no village anymore. There was no one to eat the grain. There was no future that would need grain. There was just Eleanor, alone with a field of grain that was beginning to spoil and curl in the heat. And yet the work remained. It had to be done. She stood up slowly. Every movement felt heavy, as if she were moving through water instead of air. She walked back to the village, moving through the empty streets like a ghost wandering through a world that no longer contained her. She found the tools she needed: a sickle from the blacksmith's workshop, hanging on the wall where it had been left on the last day the blacksmith had been alive. She found a binding twine from the cordwainer's shop, coiled neatly on a shelf. She found a large basket that someone had left behind, still containing a half-finished pile of grain from some previous harvests that might have been days ago, or might have been months' time, had lost all meaning. The tools felt strange in her hands, both familiar and alien. She had used such tools before. Every person in a village knew how to reap, knew the basic work of harvest, even if their primary work was something else. But she had never done it as the sole harvester, as the only person responsible for bringing in a season's work. She walked back to the field as the sun was climbing higher. The morning was already warm. It would be hot by midday, and she knew from experience that harvesting in the heat was difficult work, exhausting in ways that went beyond the physical. But she had no choice. The work would not wait for better conditions. She began to reap. The work was harder than she expected, even though she had known it would be hard. Reaching down to cut the stalks, gathering them together, binding them with twine into neat sheaves, laying them out in lines. It was work that normally would have been done by 5 or 6 people working together. They would gossip and joke to pass the time, pausing occasionally for rest and water. There would be a rhythm to it, a pattern of work and talk that made the hours pass more bearably. Eleanor worked alone. There was no one to talk to. There was no one to pass water to her when she was thirsty. There was no one to admire her work, or complain about the heat, or sing the reaping songs that made the work go faster. But she worked anyway. She worked because the work needed to be done. She worked because it was the only thing that made sense to do. By midday, she had covered a small section of the field. Her hands were blistered where the tools had rubbed against her skin. Her back ached from bending and reaching repeatedly. Her shoulders burned from the repetitive motion, and sweat ran down her face and neck, stinging her eyes. She sat down in the shade of a tree at the edge of the field and looked at what she had accomplished. It was such a small amount. The field stretched out before her, most of it still unharvested, still waiting. The wheat stalks seemed to wave at her mockingly, as if they knew that she could not possibly do all this work alone. "This is impossible," she thought. "This cannot be done. No one person can harvest an entire field alone. It's too much work. I don't have the strength. I don't have the time. By the time I finish, much of the grain will have spoiled already. This is futile." But it was not a new thought. Everything about this situation was impossible. A person could not be the only one left alive in a village. A sickness could not kill everyone. It would run out of people eventually, or God would have mercy and stop it. God would not allow this level of destruction. And yet, it had happened. God had allowed it. The impossible was the reality now. Eleanor got up and continued working. She worked until the sun began to go down, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. By then, her hands were bleeding where the blisters had broken, and her skin was rubbed raw. Her dress was soaked with sweat and dust. Her hair had come loose from its covering and hung around her face in wet strands. Her shoulders were burned from the sun, and she could feel the heat radiating from her skin. She was exhausted in a way that went beyond simple physical tiredness. It was a weariness that seemed to come from her soul, from the deepest part of her that had been broken by the plague. She left the tools in the field and walked back to the village. The sun was setting, and the light was beautiful in a way that made her want to cry. Beautiful sunsets had come every day before the plague, and Eleanor had barely noticed them. Now she noticed every color, every moment of beauty, because it seemed obscene to have beauty in a world that had been emptied of people. She should eat, she thought vaguely. Her body needed food to continue working. She went to the baker's house. The baker, Master Walter, was dead, had been dead for 3 weeks, but his store of bread and dried goods was still there. Most of it had spoiled in the summer heat. Some of it was still edible. She found some bread that was hard but not moldy. She found cheese that hadn't gone completely rancid. She found dried apples in a hanging sack. She sat on the step outside the baker's house and ate mechanically, without taste, without enjoyment. The food was nourishment, nothing more. She thought about water. She would need to drink every day if she was going to continue working. The well in the center of the village was her best option. She went to the well and drew water using the bucket that hung there. The rope was old and frayed, but still held. The water was cool and tasted of stone and earth. She drank until she was full, then drank again. The clarity of drinking fresh water was one of the few things that still seemed to matter. She went to her own house. The house felt strange to enter, even though it was the house where she had lived for her entire married life, the house where she had raised her children, the house where Robert had slept beside her every night for 30 years. But Robert was dead, and the children were dead, and the house was no longer a home. It was just a building with walls and a roof and a fire hearth. Inside, everything was as she had left it, which meant everything was chaos. The bed where Robert had died still had the blankets that she had pulled over him on his last day. The sleeping space where the children had slept was empty but contained the ghost of their presence. Her own small possessions were arranged as they had always been: a comb, a small piece of cloth that she had been working on before everything ended, a wooden cup that Robert had carved for her years ago. She lay down on the bed. It still smelled of Robert, a smell that made her chest tighten with a pain that was physical, and closed her eyes. She did not expect to sleep. Her mind was too full of images of the plague, of the people who had died, of the work that was waiting. But exhaustion claimed her quickly, shutting down her mind the way it did sometimes to protect itself from too much pain. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind of sleep that was almost like death itself. She woke in the darkness before dawn. For a moment, before consciousness fully returned, she thought that the plague had been a dream, that Robert and the children would wake up soon, that the village would come alive with the ordinary sounds of mourning. But then consciousness returned fully, and the silence remained. The darkness was absolute. The house was empty except for her. She got up without dressing and went outside. The pre-dawn was cool, and the air felt fresh in a way that the daytime air never did. She could hear the night sounds, still the rustling of small animals, the hooting of an owl. These sounds seemed louder now that the human sounds of the village were gone. Nature was reclaiming the space that humans had taken from it. She drew water and washed her face and hands. The cold water was shocking against her skin, waking her more fully. She put her dress back on and prepared for another day of harvest. Over the following days, Eleanor developed a rhythm. She worked in the field from early morning until the heat of midday became unbearable. Then she rested in the hottest part of the afternoon, sitting in the shade of a tree at the edge of the field, sometimes sleeping, sometimes simply staring at nothing. She worked again in the late afternoon until the sun began to set. She returned to the village, drew water, found food, and slept. The work was monotonous, but it was also somehow meditative in a way that surprised her. The repetitive motion of cutting, binding, laying out sheaves occupied her hands and her body in a way that left her mind free. And in that freedom, she found something unexpected. She found that as she worked, the grief did not go away, was always there. A heavy weight in her chest, a constant ache, but it changed. It became less sharp, less like something that was cutting her into pieces with every breath, and more like a landscape that she moved through. The grief was the world now. She lived in it. The work was something she did within the world of grief. She thought about the people who had died as she worked. Margaret, who had been so excited about her coming marriage to a boy named Edmund from the next village over. What had his name been? Edmund. She wondered if he was dead too, if his entire village had been wiped out like hers. She wondered if he was, at this moment, somewhere in some empty village, wondering what had happened to the girl he was supposed to marry. She thought about Margaret's wedding dress, which had been hanging in the house, half finished. Someone had needed to sew lace onto the sleeves. Margaret had been doing that work in the evenings when she finished her other tasks. The dress was still there, still half finished, waiting for hands that would never complete it. She thought about John, her son, who had been learning to be a carpenter like his father. He had wanted to open his own workshop someday, to become established and successful. He had carved things in his spare times, small boxes, decorative spoons, the kind of things that showed skill and patience. His carvings were still in the house, neat and organized on a shelf. Eleanor had picked them up and held them in her hands. These small things that he had made, these evidence of his existence and his dreams. Each carving represented hours of work, of sitting quietly with a knife and a piece of wood, creating something beautiful. All of that was gone now, lost. She thought about Thomas, her youngest, who had barely begun to live. He had been 7 years old enough to understand the world, but still young enough to be amazed by it. He had been learning to read, learning to help in the fields, learning the basic skills that a child needed to function in a village. He had had his whole life ahead of him. The unfairness of it, that he should be taken when he had barely begun to exist, when he had done nothing to deserve such a fate, made her angry. But anger was another emotion that seemed small and pointless now, inadequate to the magnitude of the loss. She thought about Robert. After 30 years of marriage, Robert had been part of her life in a way that was like air or water, so fundamental that she had unthought about it much. They had married as part of a family arrangement, as was normal. They had had children together. They had worked side by side to maintain the household and their place in the village. They had not been passionate with each other, but they had been solid, dependable. He had been a good man, an honest man, a man who did his duty without complaining. And now he was gone, and she was alone in a way that she had never been alone before. As she worked in the field, Eleanor found herself talking to the dead. She would cut stalks and bind them and say things to Robert. "The field is nearly half done now," she might say. "The wheat is coming in well, better than I expected." Or sometimes, "I cannot do this alone. I need your help. I need the children. I need someone. Please come back. Please tell me what I'm supposed to do." But the dead did not answer. There was only silence, the wind moving through the grain, the distant sound of crows. By the end of the first week of harvest, Eleanor realized that she could not bring in all the crops alone. The field was large: 3 acres of wheat, 2 acres of barley, 1.5 acres of rye. To harvest all of it would take weeks, and by that time, much of it would have spoiled. She would have to make choices. She would have to decide which crops to save and which to let rot. This thought struck her as odd, almost funny. She found herself laughing, not the normal laughter of joy or humor, but something harder and stranger, something that hurt her throat. As she stood in the field with a sickle in her bleeding hand, she was alone, the only person left alive in an entire village, and she was making decisions about which crops to save, as if the grain mattered, as if winter would come and need to be survived. Even if no one else needed to eat, she would. And she did not know if she would die. Soon part of her expected that the plague would take her, that she would join the dead door if she would live for a long time. If she lived, she would need grain. She would need food to survive the winter. So the work did matter, even though it was just for her. She made a decision. She would focus on the wheat. Wheat was the most important crop, the one that provided the most nourishment and kept longest. She would harvest as much wheat as she could, bringing it in carefully and storing it properly. If the barley and rye spoiled, then so be it. She would have at least done what she could. She reorganized her work. She cut the wheat in the warmest part of the day, when the grain was driest. She worked methodically, focusing all her attention on the wheat field, leaving the barley and rye for later, or perhaps not at all. Her hands developed a rhythm: reach down, cut the stalks, gather them, bind them, lay them out, reach down, cut, gather, bind, lay out, over and over, until the motion became almost automatic. By the end of 2 weeks, she had brought in all the wheat. Her body was leaner now. She had lost weight, though she was eating regularly. The constant work, the heat, the emotional exhaustion, these were burning through her reserves. Her hands were covered in calluses and scars from the sickle and the binding twine. Her back and shoulders were dark with sun, burned so dark that her skin felt tight. Her blonde hair, what she could see of it under her covering, was becoming lighter from the sun, almost white in places. She was changing, becoming something different from what she had been. But the wheat was sheaved. She had bound it into sheaves and arranged them in orderly rows to dry in the sun. The golden color looked beautiful to her, almost obscene in its beauty. All of that wheat, all of that grain, all of that potential nourishment, laid out in neat rows. It was the most beautiful thing she had seen since the plague came. She should thresh it, she thought vaguely. The grain needed to be removed from the chaff. That was the next step in the process. But threshing was work that normally took several people, several days. She could do it alone, perhaps, but it would take her a very long time. And the grain was safe for now, protected from the weather in its sheaf form. She could leave it for a while. She looked at the barley and rye, still waiting to be cut, still golden and whole. The barley was beginning to degrade slightly. Some of it would be lost already. She could tell from the way the stalks were browning. She decided to harvest the rye, which was the secondary crop, but still valuable. The barley could be left for last, after the rye was done, or perhaps left completely if the work became too much. As she worked on the rye field, Eleanor noticed something odd. In the distance, near the edge of the village, she saw a figure moving. At first, she thought it was her imagination. She had been alone for so long that her mind was playing tricks on her, creating visions of people where there were none. She had read about people going mad from loneliness, seeing things that weren't there. Was this what was happening to her? She blinked and looked again, but the figure was there. It was real. She could see it moving slowly, seeming to struggle with each step. It was a person, she could tell that much, from the shape and the way it moved. Eleanor stopped working and stared at the figure for a long moment, her heart beginning to beat faster. She realized that she was afraid. What if it was something other than a person? What if the plague had changed people into something else? What if she was seeing a ghost? But ghosts didn't move slowly like that, didn't seem to struggle with each step. This was a living person, or at least something that had been living recently. Then, unable to help herself, unable to resist the pull of seeing another human being after so many weeks alone, she began to run. As she got closer, she could see that it was indeed a man. He was thin, almost skeletal, and he was moving with difficulty, as if each step was a great effort. He was wearing the remains of what had once been good clothing, a merchant's coat, though it was torn and dirty and stained with things that Eleanor didn't want to think about. As she got even closer, she realized that it was Master William, the wool merchant from the next village over. She had seen him a few times at the market in the larger town where the villages traded. He was a prosperous man, or had been. Now he looked like he was dying. "Master William," she called out, hardly believing that she was speaking words to another person, that she was seeing another living human being. Her voice sounded strange to her ears, rough from disuse. "Master William, it's Eleanor, from Thornfield." Eleanor, of Thornfield. The man looked up slowly, as if it took great effort for him to lift his head. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt, his skin grayish. But he was alive. He was real. She wasn't imagining him. "Eleanor," he said slowly, as if he was having difficulty remembering her. "Eleanor, ... I know you. Yes, I remember you." She reached him and helped him sit down. He was running a fever sheet, could feel the heat coming off his skin, could see the bright feverish light in his eyes. The dark swellings were visible under his arms, and she could smell the sickness on him. That particular smell that the plague carried with it. "You shouldn't be near me," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper, weak and hoarse. "I'm sick. The plague. I have the plague. I'm dying." "I know," Eleanor said. And she did know. She could see it in him, the same marks she had seen in all the others. The swellings, the feverish brightness, the particular way that the plague consumed the body. "But I'm still alive. The sickness didn't take me. After everyone else, I'm still alive." "Lucky," William said. He lay back on the ground, breathing heavily, as if even the effort of sitting up had exhausted him. "So lucky. I've come from Ashford. Everyone there is dead. Everyone, I thought. I thought maybe somewhere else would be different. Maybe somewhere else people still lived. Maybe there was some village that the plague had passed over. Some place where the people were safe. I've been walking for days, looking for anyone still alive." Eleanor brought him water. She brought him food. She helped him to the church, which had the most shelter and relative protection from the weather, and made him as comfortable as she could. She knew, even as she did these things, even as some part of her still hoped that he might recover, that Master William was dying. The fever was strong in him, and the sickness had progressed far. He had maybe days left, perhaps only hours. The plague didn't allow for long illnesses. It was fast, brutal, final. But for the first time since the plague had taken her family, Eleanor was not alone. There was another human being in the village, even if that human being was dying. Even if the sound of his breathing was the only company she would have, it was something. It was real. It was proof that she had not imagined the entire world, that she had not gone completely mad. Master William lived for 3 more days. Eleanor sat with him and listened to him talk about his life, his travels, his family. His wife was dead. His children were dead. Everyone he had known, everyone he had done business with, everyone in the town where he had lived his whole life, was dead. He had set out from Ashford in a kind of desperate hope that somehow, somewhere, people had survived. But everywhere he went, he found the same thing: empty villages, dead people, the silence of a world that was no longer alive. The hope had carried him for days, but now that he had found another person, found Eleanor, the hope seemed to drain away. He had found someone, but they were both just the last survivors, the last people left alive in a world that was ending. "I think," he said on the second day of his time in Thornfield, his voice weaker than it had been even the day before, "that we might be the last two people in the world. Perhaps there are others, somewhere else, in some distant place that I will never reach, but I think we might be the last." "And if we are?" Eleanor asked. "Then it doesn't matter," William said. "Nothing matters anymore. The world is ending. We are the last. There is no future. There is no one to carry on, no one to remember what the world was like before. In a year or two, when we are gone, there will be nothing left. Just empty villages and empty fields, and the slow return of the world to the wild." He was right, Eleanor thought. If they were the last, if this plague had killed everyone, then it didn't matter that she was harvesting wheat. It didn't matter that she was trying to survive. When he was gone, she would be alone again, and alone with no one left in any village, alone in an empty world. Survival meant nothing. It was just the continuation of a body that had no purpose. It was the continuation of life when all meaning had been drained out of it. But even as she thought this, even as she accepted the logical conclusion that nothing mattered, she continued to care for him. She brought him water. She cleaned his wounds. She listened to him talk about his life and his travels and the business deals he had made and the towns he had visited. She sat with him through the night, watching him breathe, waiting for each breath to be his last. When he died, on the evening of the third day, in the cool darkness just as the sun was setting, Eleanor wept. She wept for Master William, whom she had barely known before he came to Thornfield dying. She wept for herself. She wept for the world that was ending. And when she was done weeping, when she had cried until she was empty and hollow, she prepared his body with the care that she would have wanted for any person. She washed him. She arranged his clothing. She buried him in the churchyard, next to the other graves that had been dug during the plague, marking his grave with a wooden cross that she carved with a knife. After his burial, Eleanor returned to the fields. The rye needed harvesting. Work was one of the few things that still made sense. Work occupied her hands and her body, even if her mind was broken. She finished the rye. The barley she left. Some of it would spoil, but there was only so much that one person could do. The barley would fall to the ground eventually and provide nutrients for next year's growth. If there was a next year, if there would be anyone to see it. By the time she had finished the rye harvest, it was early September. The weather was beginning to change. The air was becoming cooler in the mornings, and the nights now required a blanket. The light was taking on that slanting quality that came in autumn, the particular golden light that made everything look like it was ending. The days were growing shorter. Winter was coming. Eleanor made a decision. She would not thresh the grain during the harvest season. Instead, she would spend the rest of the summer and the autumn doing other things. She would need to prepare for winter to fix the roof of her house, to make sure her stores were secure, to gather wood for the fire. She would need to figure out how to thresh the grain when the weather was colder, when the heavy work would be less dangerous. Winter would come, and she would need to survive it. So the work mattered, at least for that reason. But first, she would mourn. She set aside a day she wasn't sure which day it was. The calendar had become meaningless to her, had stopped being relevant somewhere in the spring end. She went to each grave in the churchyard. She counted them and found that there were 47 graves. 47 people from a village that had once had 150, more than a quarter of the population gone, all of them in the space of a few months. She said the names of the dead, the ones she could remember: Margaret, John, Thomas, Robert, Walter the baker, Edmund the blacksmith, Mary the widow, young Thomas the apprentice, named for her son but not related. She said the names aloud, speaking to the graves, as if the dead could hear her. She said prayers that she half remembered from her childhood, words that came to her from some deep place in her memory. She spoke to the dead as if they could hear her. She told them that she missed them. She told them that she didn't know how to live in a world without them. She told them that she was sorry she had survived when they had not. She told them that she was trying to do the work that needed to be done. When she was done with the graves, when she had visited each one and said what she needed to say, she went back to her house. She lay in the bed where Robert had died and she let herself cry. She cried until she had no more tears. She cried until she had cried herself empty, until the well of tears had run dry. And then, in the emptiness, in the exhaustion that came after hours of crying, something shifted. Something changed inside of her. Eleanor got up from the bed. She washed her face with cold water from the well. She changed her dress into one that was cleaner. She looked at herself in the small mirror that she had owned for years, a luxury, but one that a woman could have if she was careful with money and if her husband was reasonably prosperous. The woman looking back at her was a stranger. She was thin. Her face was burned dark from the sun. Her hair had gone grayer, but her eyes were still alive. They were tired and sad, but they still held something. She was still here. She was still alive. She went out to the fields and she looked at the grain that she had harvested. The wheat was drying properly in neat rows, golden and full of potential. The rye was similarly arranged. Even the barley, most of which she had left unharvested, was still there, still golden, still full of the possibility of nourishment for someone, someday. I will survive this, Eleanor thought. I don't know why I was spared and the others were not. I do not know if it was God's will or chance or some property of my body that made me resistant to the sickness. I do not know if I will live to be old or if I will die tomorrow from some accident or illness. But today, I am alive. And if I am alive, then I will do what the living do. I will tend the fields. I will prepare for winter. I will harvest what I can. And perhaps, though this thought was so fragile that she barely dared to hold it, barely dared to believe it, perhaps, if I survive, others will come. People from other villages might have survived. They might travel here, looking for a place to settle, as Master William had traveled looking for survivors. And if they come, they will find fields that have been harvested and stored. They will find a village that is ready for them. They will find grain. This thought that her work might have a future, might have a purpose beyond her own survival, might somehow matter beyond her individual life, was the first hope she had felt since the plague came. Eleanor spent the rest of September and October preparing the village for winter and for the possibility of new arrivals. She used tools from the carpenter's workshop to repair the roof of her house. She gathered wood and stacked it carefully for the cold months. She tended to the stores in the bakery and the granary, organizing them carefully, figuring out how much grain she had, how long it would last if she was careful. She cleaned out some of the empty houses, preparing them so that if anyone did come, they would have shelter. She maintained the well, making sure the water was clean and accessible. She also, despite her initial certainty that she was alone, began to hope that others would come. This hope was dangerous. It could lead to disappointment, could crush her further if no one came, but she found that she needed it. She needed to believe that there was a future, even if she didn't know what that future would look like. In late October, her hope was rewarded. A group of people arrived at the village. They had come from the south, from areas that had been hit hard by the plague, looking for new homes. They were 15 in number, men, women, children, ranging in age from a baby to an old man. They had survived the plague either through immunity or through having lived in areas that had been less affected. When they saw that the village was largely empty except for Eleanor, they were first frightened, then gradually accepting of the reality. When they realized that one person had stayed, had worked to maintain the fields, had kept the village in some kind of order, they were grateful. "You harvested this?" one of the men asked, looking at the stored grain and the orderly rows of dried sheaves. "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "I harvested it." "Alone?" he asked. "Yes, alone." The newcomers were amazed. They elected to stay. They moved into the empty houses. They helped Eleanor thresh the grain. They cleaned and prepared the church. They began to rebuild the village, starting from the foundation of what Eleanor had done. Eleanor was no longer alone. Over the following winter and spring, more people came. Some came in small groups. Some came singly, desperate and alone. A few of them arrived already dying from the plague, and Eleanor did what she could for them, sheltering them, nursing them. Most of them died, but some lived, and those who lived became part of the village. By the spring of 1351, Thornfield had a population of about 30 people. It was much less than it had been before. The plagued village had been home to perhaps 150 souls before the dying came, but it was not empty. It was alive again, in a small and struggling way. Eleanor found herself becoming the keeper of the village's memory. She knew where things were stored. She knew which houses had supplies still hidden in them. She knew which fields were good for which crops. She knew the village, as it had been, and as it had become. The newcomers looked to her for guidance. She was not the official leader, a man named Robert, no relation to her dead husband, though it made her heart hurt to call him by that name, became the village bailiff, but she was respected. Her knowledge was valuable. Her survival was seen as a sign of something, though Eleanor was never quite sure what. On a warm day in spring, as they were working together to prepare the fields for planting, a woman named Catherine, who had come to the village from the south and had lost her entire family to the plague, asked Eleanor how she had survived. "I don't know," Eleanor said honestly. "I was waiting to die. I expected that the sickness would come for me as it came for everyone else. But it didn't." "Do you think it was God?" Catherine asked. "Do you think God chose to spare you? That you have a purpose?" Eleanor thought about this question. She thought about the weeks she had spent alone, harvesting grain for no one, talking to the dead, watching the world end. She thought about the moment when Master William had appeared, dying but real. She thought about the hope that had come when she realized that her work might have a purpose, might have a future. "I don't know if it was God," she said. "Maybe it was just chance. Maybe my body was resistant to the sickness. Maybe I was lucky. But I do know that I'm glad I didn't give up. The work mattered. The harvest mattered. If I hadn't done it, the newcomers wouldn't have found supplies to help them survive the winter. The village wouldn't have been able to continue." Catherine nodded, thinking about this. "So it wasn't about surviving for yourself," Catherine said. "It was about doing the work, even when no one was there to see it, even when it seemed pointless." "Yes," Eleanor said. "That's it exactly." Eleanor lived for many more years after that. She lived to see the village recover and grow. New people came regularly, fleeing depopulated areas or seeking new homes. The population grew. Fields were tended. Children were born, the first births in Thornfield in over a year. And what a joy that was. The sound of a baby crying. The proof that life continued. There was still grief, still trauma. The memory of the plague, of the death that had taken so many, was always there, always part of the fabric of daily life. But life continued. The work continued. Eleanor grew older. The trauma of the plague years aged her faster than normal living might have. But she lived. She lived to see children grow up in the recovered village. She lived to see apprentices trained and become masters of their trades. She lived to see young people marry and have children of their own. She lived to see the ordinary rhythms of village life resume, slowly and painfully, but resume nonetheless. When Eleanor finally died, at the age of 62, much of the village turned out for her funeral. They came not just to mourn her, but to honor her. She was the memory of what they had survived. She was the one who had kept the harvest alive, literally and figuratively, when everything was dying. She was the bridge between the world that had been and the world that was becoming.